Sierra Leone's role. The question of the Security Council reform, because you have a very unique hat. You were a member of the UN Security Council as part of the A3+, but you were also, and you remain to be the head of the Committee of 10 Heads of State and Government of the African Union on the reform of the UN Security Council. I would like you to share your experience, because one of the things that you did during that tenure is making that as one of the major area of engagement in the UN Security Council. And I remember the ambassador of Guyana the year before last mentioning that it was a taboo in the UN Security Council to talk about the reform of the Security Council itself. And you, through that high-level debate led by President Bio, actually broke that taboo. And how was that experience, please?
Oh, I think it's really, if not the most significant action that we took in the Security Council. Because, as you say, His Excellency President Julius Maada Bio is the coordinator of the African Union Committee of 10 Heads of State and Government on the reform of Security Council. So we have a continental responsibility. When we're going to the Council, we made this as a priority to bring the issue of the discussion of the reform of the Security Council to the Council. That was a taboo. Many members of the Security Council have tried. They could not, and they had to find ways to have a broader discussion without discussing the issue, including one African member state, by the way. I think Gabon tried something during their tenure. India tried to do something, they couldn't. So we campaigned on this. And so for us, it was an issue of a continental responsibility, but also accountability. President Bio was very clear that we have to discuss this issue in terms of his instructions to me as a permanent representative in New York. So we had to get to work immediately. As soon as we elected, this was one issue that we started working on with the P5s. And we had really an ambitious approach to the issue. We wanted an open debate on Security Council reform, a sort of mirroring the IGN intergovernmental approach in the UN General Assembly, simply because we wanted everyone to be on record. Because even in the General Assembly, we have the framework document of 2015, it's 120 member states are submitted, and then we have the elements paper. So we don't have all of the views of all of the member states on the issue. But the most important members, I say important because of the charter. You need the P5s to ratify a charter amendment for it to come into force. So you need them to agree. And so you also need their views on record. Through the long discussions, we're able to frame the topic that focused on Africa, so redressing the historical injustice and enhancing African representation in the Security Council. It's the topic that was agreed upon by the members of the Security Council. Instead of an open debate, we agreed to a debate, high-level debate, which was presided over by President Bio, so he chaired. And of course, we had the members of the Security Council, but we also invited the C10 member states. And so they were there at the ministerial level to also speak to the issue, which was also quite important. We saw then the full force of Africa in the room. We invited the president of the General Assembly because essentially he's the one that is leading the IGN discussions. And incredibly, we got the views of the permanent members. So first, there's this agreement that we need to reform the Security Council. And second, of course, we got their views on record. There's this issue about do you support Africa or you support the common African position as articulated in the Ezulwini Consensus and State Declaration. Mm-hmm. And now we can tell because we have records of the positions of the P5, but also we have the positions of some of the E10 members that are in various groupings, whether it's G4 or UFC, Uniting for Consensus, and L69, which was very important, and CARICOM, because Guyana was also the chair of CARICOM. Now, immediately after that debate, in terms of the incremental approach and support to reform in a common African position, the United States administration The United States then announced that they support 2 seats for Africa, which was a major progress, albeit without support for the veto. So, of course, one of the clusters of Security Council reform. But we saw that as a major step forward. And then we went into the Summit of the Future in September, Pact of the Future, where all of the member states, heads of state and government, committed to redressing the historical injustice against Africa, but importantly, to treat Africa as a priority and a special case. Also, there was an agreement for member states and groups to submit their reform model so that a consolidated model will be developed. So this would take us away from this discussion about text-based negotiation or not text-based negotiation, which has become really a binary issue and it's not moving the reform process forward. So in that year, and from 2024 to now, we saw these milestones. So first, we've been able to implement all of the AU summit decisions, which is also very important on Security Council reform, because it's one thing for heads of state to come to Addis and agree, it's another thing to implement them. So we were in Equatorial Guinea, Oyala, we had the Oyala Plan of Action. We've implemented everything in terms of the ministerial meeting between the C10 and P5s. We have the positions of the P5s in the debate that we had in 2024, presided by the coordinator. We have the Pact of the Future with a clear position that we have to redress historical injustice, treat Africa as a priority and special case. The next step is the model. So we've been working on the model with a retreat in Freetown. So we had a Freetown outcome document. This was developed by the ambassadors as mandated by the Assembly. We submitted it to the ministers, the foreign ministers of the C10. They met in Lusaka and they've agreed to it. The C10 heads of state met virtually and adopted it. And now it will be presented by the C10 in this assembly for endorsement. Once we get that, then we'll submit it in the IGN process. And within this short period of time, we've seen implementation and really significant progress on the issue. That is down to really, as I say, a clear leadership and vision from the very top and implementation at our level that has brought us this far.
You made reference to the model. Basically, we know what Africa's position is in terms of what it would like to see its presence in the UN Security Council. I think the model basically would expand that vision to say what is Africa's vision of the membership and composition of the UN Security Council as a whole, right? Take us through that. What is, Africa's proposition of the model, and what informed this model, and the possibilities of this model actually advancing or moving the needle further forward.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of expectation of what the model should look like, at least from the UN perspective, the model calls on member states and interest group to give a sort of an idea of what a reform Security Council should look like. And so this is really inviting member states to not just look at their position, but look at the overall comprehensive reform of the Security Council based on the clusters, the 5 clusters, and the decision that was taken by member state. Now, it's then getting to a little bit of it's trickier for the C10 and African members, because what we've been doing is based on the mandate, which is to promote, advance, and canvass support for the Common African Position. So that is our remit. If you want to say things beyond that, you have to come back to the African Union, and then, of course, you can say a bit more. And so what informs the model is essentially the Common African Position as articulated in Ezulwini Consensus and State Declaration. And you can go way back to the Harare Declaration, 1997, 2 permanent seats for Africa, 2 additional non-permanent seats, so a total of 5 non-permanent seats. And the critical provision that Africa would select its permanent members. Of course, there will be elections by the General Assembly, but the selection will be done by Africa. That is to maintain the African unity throughout this process. And we've been able to maintain it for 2 decades. That's a significant achievement. We've also included in the model because in 2015, when we had an Africa presidency of the General Assembly, His Excellency Sam Kutesa of Uganda was the president of the General Assembly. He came up with an initiative to have a framework document. And so there was a submission from the African group led by the C10 into the 2015 framework document. That explained in this context of a broader Reform Security Council the remit of the numbers of permanent members, because we are asked in terms of size and composition, what would be the ideal size and composition of the Security Council. So we've always given a number of mid-20s, right? Not more than 26. That will include increase in seats in the permanent and non-permanent category. So in the framework document, we have up to 11. The current 5 and 4 more that will include the 2 for Africa, and of course not more than 26 in terms of non-permanent seats. That will include 2 additional non-permanent seats. These have been reflected in subsequent AU Assembly decisions, so it's now part of the broad range of issues which we advance in the General Assembly. So that's what we've combined and put together in the model. And there's a third part, which is how do we operationalize this issue of treating Africa as a priority and a special case? So post the U.S. position on supporting 2 seats for Africa without a veto, we made it very clear in that part that expanding permanent membership and, of course, giving permanent seat to Africa must mean, if the veto is retained, giving veto to the African permanent members. So that's the third layer about what it means by special case and priority. It's drafted in a way that is inclusive. It could mean more, but following decision 62557, this is the decision how the IGN process should be conducted, where you want a broad, wireless political acceptance. Why? Because you need to meet the threshold of for it to be adopted and ratification, so you need a broad range of support. There's a question of when do you go now, learning from the 2005 experience. Do you put in a resolution without support, which you have to withdraw, or make sure that you have a broad range of support, and then when you eventually you table something, it's something that will be accepted by the broadest possible membership. So a simple answer to your question would be, the model essentially reflects the common African position agreed in Ezulwini and SEAT, the 2015 framework document, and 2 points on the right to the veto based on the Pact of the Future.
There was another in November, basically, where it was another interesting moment where I thought was, how did Ambassador Michael, pull that off, where the E10 now have to come and speak with one voice, expressing basically full support to African aspiration for membership, permanent membership in the UN Security Council. I thought that it's important to really connect the seriousness with which you took your role as coordinator of the C10 and plugged it into your membership in the UN Security Council for the 2-year time that you had. It would be remiss of me if I didn't make reference to it as we move to other areas.
No, thank you. So in addition to the debate, which is what people normally refer to, I think there were 2 important moments where we used, when I say we, Sierra Leone and Algeria, because Algeria is also part of the C10, we used our membership in the Security Council to move the reform agenda forward. So first on working methods. When we went to the council, Algeria discovered in one of the committees that elected members don't have the same level of access to document as permanent members. And so when we're really insisting on permanent membership, there are many issues, many reasons why. So you go to a meeting, your point of reference and documents you have are different from permanent members. And so they took it as an issue, and of course, initially built support from the A3+, to have equal access to documentation for permanent members and elected members. And then the E10 supported and eventually got to a point where this is now agreed practice. So really a lot of commendation for the work done by Algeria then. So the issue which you pointed out during our presidency, again, we agreed to hold the debate on working methods during our presidency because the council could not agree on subsidiary bodies, the chair of the groups. So the debate was held quite late. And the co-chairs were Denmark and Pakistan. So Pakistan being, of course, a strong UFC member, was to read the statement on behalf of the E10 members. And of course, a joint statement means that you have to include the views of all of the members of the E10. So of course, with a continental mandate and understanding the dynamics of the council, we insisted that we have to reflect the language of the Pact of the Future. So that is how we were able to get to a General Assembly sort of led language into the Security Council records. But then you have all of the interest groups because Pakistan is UFC, of course, C10, CARICOM, L69, all speaking with one voice and in the council to say that you have to redress the historical injustice and treating Africa as a priority. So it's all down to seizing the moment, understanding the dynamics, and insisting on the mandate that we have. So that is really the African leadership that we talk about. Once you understand where you are, understand the dynamics, you seize the opportunity and the moment.
Now, if we reflect on a little bit one other moment during your tenure, you made reference to earlier on in terms of the role of the ESRI, one of which is adopting a common statement and delivering a common statement, which has grown really stronger and stronger through the years. Now over 100 joint statements covering a wide range of issues. The other was the pen holdership, to which you made reference to. In that respect, broadly speaking, for many years, African issues were not issues in respect of which permanent members actually exercise veto. Since African members are expected to take lead on, and their voice is usually the one that addresses and takes precedence. But last year, in relation to Sudan, there was a resolution put forward. You were a pen holder of that resolution, and it was vetoed. I would imagine that, but I would like you to give us a sense of how the veto against that resolution could have avoided. Could it have been avoided? And if it could have been avoided, who should have played what kind of role? And what are the lessons from that experience, basically, moving forward for succeeding members of the ESRI? I mean, you mentioned DRC, Liberia, and Somalia currently. And of course, I think the plus one is Ghana is also living with you, right?
So Ghana left, yes.
Left with you, yeah.
So I think I'll start from the point of pen holdership being an expression of influence and leverage in the council, because then you direct the frame how the council will adopt and decide on a particular issue. You produce the first draft, and usually you determine when the time is ripe for you to put the text in blue, which is getting it ready for adoption. But it comes with a responsibility. It means, of course, you need the resources to know exactly what's happening on the ground, and in very sensitive political issues, you have to take a position. That's a responsibility that comes with it. I link that to AU Constitutive Act and the issue of non-indifference, particularly in the African context, where you see atrocities occurring on a scale which really was unacceptable. And so we had, and we throughout, there was a common African position on the Sudan file. We delivered joint statement, we negotiated as a group on many other products. And on this particular file, with UK as the pen holder, After the non-compliance with the previous resolution that was adopted, of course, with A3 plus membership, the view was taken that the parties to the conflict then have gone to Jeddah and agreed to a Jeddah declaration on the protection of civilians. And so for us, of course, protection of civilians is linked to accountability, and it was an important priority for us. And we are dealing with an African file. And so when we were engaged by the penholder to work jointly on this issue, meaning we bring both the African influence and, of course, the traditional penholdership to the file, we try to find a product that could be acceptable by all of the members of the Security Council, and of course we positively influence the conflict context in Sudan. And so we agreed that what we're going to put forward is essentially what has been agreed by the parties, which is the Jeddah Declaration. If you've agreed to protect civilians, honor it, and we give it one layer of enforceability by it becoming a Security Council resolution. But the difficulty at the time was that it was when the great power rivalries and the conflict in Ukraine was influencing almost every other file in the Security Council. So my honest assessment is that the Sudan draft resolution was a victim of that rivalry, in this case between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation that vetoed the resolution. The explanation that was given was that there was not enough consultation. That was not the point. We consulted, particularly in the context Sudan and the representative of the government. In New York, we met regularly on the issue, and I think overall it was just the resolution being a victim of the circumstances at the time. But we continued working on the Sudan file as an A3, an A3 plus, and then from time to time we were in, based on the guiding principles, not all A3 plus members will be willing to join on a particular initiative. But the guidelines are clear enough to allow a member state. For us, accountability was a priority, protection of civilians was a priority, that will allow for us to co-pen and shape the resolution. And we got the resolution, we got the UK to agree to put forward a resolution that essentially reflected the agreement of the member states. Yes, we thought that we're doing that with the UK and Sierra Leone being the bridge builder in the council and engagement with the Russian Federation would have been enough to save the resolution. But regrettably, at the time it was stable, the relationship between the two permanent members was just difficult. I think notwithstanding the explanations that were given, that would be my assessment of what transpired.
I mean, part of it is, the extent to which, if, for example, the representatives of Sudan were fully behind it, I would imagine that they, provided support to it. Whether, any aspect of their, whatever hesitation they may have in, for whatever reason, might have given also that opening that has been, at least looking from here, it appeared that there might have been that aspect of the situation as well. I don't know how that played itself out. But the most important is, of course, what you said.
Yeah. I think we also have to go into the situation in Sudan at the time and clearly try to ascertain what was the prevailing situation. Remember the start of the conflict. Sudan has been suspended by the African Union because of the unconstitutional nature in which the government seized power. We had all of these initiatives that were ongoing, the AU-led process that was focused on, of course, the democratic space and ensuring that whenever there is the opportunity for a reversion to the process for democratic governance, enough work has been done. So we have the AU process, and we had many mediation processes. We looked at the Sudan situation at the time, various aspects, supporting the AU process, supporting the UN process, the personal envoy of the Secretary General, Lamamra, who of course is of the UN process, dealing with the issue of accountability, because of course we had atrocities right in front of our eyes. So supporting that process, including the ICC investigation that was ongoing and the prosecution, and ensuring that they have enough support for extending the investigation even beyond Darfur. So we were not silent about our views on the overall aspect of the Sudan situation. And certainly dealing with the external factor. It was still there. How do you address external influence in Sudan? So 5 layers in which we were looking at the conflict in Sudan. And so when the issue of protection of civilians came up, it was the question of looking at how do you protect civilians. It meant that we were engaging with our colleague, representative of Sudan in New York. It meant that we also spoke to how Sudan could take steps in protecting civilians, including accountability. So it wasn't saying that once you support accountability measures, you're really removing the government from taking steps to really take on its obligations. We were very supportive of that. So that's even in the ICC context, it's the principle of complementarity. However, at the time, we had a situation where the civilians needed protection. So we engage on that basis, both parties. And before we have the civilian administration and the return of the Sudanese armed forces to Khartoum, what we had were 2 conflicting parties and the civilians in the middle. And so for us, we, again, as I said, sticking to principles even within African context, where you engage but you stick to your principles. Because it is that consistency that will allow you to speak to the same issues in other contexts. I think there was a difference of views on what consultation would mean. We consulted, they were informed, but of course there was a difference of views on how that was explained in the public sphere.
I think we are coming to the end of our really important conversation. I would like to pick on the aspect of whether the model that is being proposed for UN Security Council reform, what are the possibilities? Because one of the questions that people ask is basically that in the current model, in the current environment, there has to be some kind of concession from somewhere, all right? And part of what was stuck was this between text-based and not text-based. Now this seems to basically make that, unnecessary. From what you said, there would be a consolidated model. A consolidated model that would bring together the models proposed by individual member states and interest groups, basically. All right. Do you have, from your own consideration of the different models that have been proposed already on the table and so on, and the state of current positions on Security Council report, at least on Security Council reform, at least from the IGN process, do you think that there would be a possibility for a breakthrough?
Let me get to maybe what is expected in terms of the consolidated model. And the one document of reference would be the co-chair's element paper that have been developed over time. At one point in time, there was no full reference of the Common African Position. And we insisted over perhaps 2 years of the IGN session that the Common African Position be reflected fully. And that was achieved. And throughout, in the submission of the models in the structured dialogue, most of them have incorporated the Common African Position as it is to 2 permanent seats for Africa and 2 additional non-permanent seats. Because I think there's the understanding that, one, that is non-negotiable from the African group perspective. It is the least that is expected. In fact, it demands at least.
Exactly.
So it is at least. And when you look at all of the elements and parameters, really it's a reflection of at least what Africa really rightfully should get. And so the demand is not as if it's out of place. And so once the model that we've developed, and hopefully it will be endorsed in this assembly, is submitted within that framework, the expectation is that the co-chairs will take the views of not only Africa, but the broad membership that have supported the African position and the model. Of course, there's one group with a difficult position that they don't want to see an expansion in permanent category, that's the UFC, and they've explained their own longer-term seat as a way to address the historical injustice. That is not compatible with the common African position, and we've said it repeatedly, and the co-chairs have been able to reflect our position in most of the documents, of course respecting their views, but knowing that we've always insisted. And so we look to what the co-chairs will produce, but we have to first submit, because that's what will preempt the development of the consolidated model. And I would say we'll take the next steps from there once we see the consolidated model. The plan will be, once we see it, and then we trust that it will conform with the common African position, we come back to the assembly through the sit-in process and really deliberate on the next steps. And so hopefully we'll be back next year for an assembly with a consolidated model, and really with a request from the sit-in to the African member states on what next.
Okay, so basically this year may be the year when we will have the consolidated model. We have the submissions from all groups, and okay, that's great. And given where the world is, where the UN Security Council is increasingly seen as being completely out of sync with the realities of the world, not being able to prevent very serious threats to international peace and security, not being able to arrest them, contain them once those two serious threats to international peace and security erupted. There is a sense of, I wouldn't say despair, but there is a sense that this institutional setup has run its course, that it has become irrelevant, that we need to do something different, something new. There is also a civil society-led initiative for invoking Article 109 of the UN Charter, for going for a review of the UN Charter, which wouldn't just be limited to, of course, UN Security Council reform, but Security Council reform would be one of that. What is your reflection to people who would say, perhaps, we should put together a new global governance architecture, having regard to all the fundamental shifts and changes that happened, and the many new serious issues that emerged in the world? Any reflections on that?
I think that's the question of our time. The UN, founded 80 years ago, is based on three fundamental pillars: peace and security, cooperation to achieve sustainable development, and certainly the promotion and protection of human rights. And I think those three pillars are as relevant as they were in 1945 and as they are now in 2026. Of course, how those have been operationalized are some of the issues that we have to deal with. For example, on development, the structural inequalities, the UN system as a whole, and the IFIs that need reforming. Even in the debate on UN at 80 in the General Assembly, we all talked about UN being under strain and the need for reform. Of course, the overall reform was that if we hadn't the United Nations, we will still establish something that resembles, or that is the United Nations now. So it tells us that yes, we have to reform the UN and get it fit for purpose. That includes, in the context of peace and security, the UN Security Council that has the mandate under the collective security scheme. Now, I don't want to be too philosophical and get into the concept and approach to security, but if the collective security council that is based on international law fails, where do we go to? We've seen that for now we see an expression of a return to hegemonic hegemonies, right? Might is right, and the great power now exercising a lot of influence on the basis of transaction. Middle powers are coming up, and the call by one of the head of government of a middle power state is to bring middle powers together. What do you get to? Balance of power. That also has proven not to have worked, because we see how, because of the lack of trust, that failed and led to World War II. So the options, we can't revert to the two available options, whether it's going back to a global hegemon or balance of power, which could fail. But really it's to get the collective security scheme under international law to work. So it means we have to work within the Security Council, within the United Nations, to get it to work, including reforming the Security Council. I think this moment offers us the opportunity to really advance this discussion on Security Council reform. The C10 is guided by the views and temperature of the African member states. In moments of crisis, there are opportunities. We think that if we're consistent in our position and we make the incremental progress, we'll be able to reform the United Nations on the two pillars, but also reflect the third pillar and a Security Council that will be legitimate. We also mean that we have to look inwardly in how do we finance some of the solutions, because at the end of the day, really, the greater call for respect and equality is how we are also able to discharge the burdens and obligations that will come with it. Yes, it's a recognition that we're in a difficult time. The system that offers us the opportunity to make fundamental progress despite the constraints, despite the history and the structural imbalances, is under strain. We should use this opportunity to move ahead with some of the clear objective of reforming and addressing those strains and charting a clear path for Africa.
Excellent. Just one final thing. I think as you close off, marking the end of 2 great years as a member of the Security Council, any reflections that you have on things that you wished were done differently, or that based on that you'd like to advise the new African 3+ members of the UN Security Council, including in terms of their engagement with the permanent 5 as they fight over each other. And I thought the point that you made was really profound, that the possibility of the A3 playing a moderating role, a bridge building role, because that is also what, in making a case for Africa's membership in the permanent category, based on the Ezulwini Consensus, the high-level panel report jointly facilitated by Namibia, the current president of Namibia, under her leadership, and Amani Africa, was basically to say, because of the strong desire and interest, and the stake are very high for African countries, they would have the incentive to play that bridge building and moderating role, to create that common ground for advancing the effective, operation of the UN Security Council. Any reflections that you may have on that?
I think from the Sierra Leone perspective, we thought that we had a clear view of what we wanted to achieve in terms of our priorities, and we were able to really, from each priority, advance the views that we had, and for some, we were able to also really get the Council to agree to critical product, for example, on youth, peace and security. In a difficult time, when everyone was saying UN 80 and no new mandate, we got a resolution 2807 that would create space for young people to engage and be effective in peace and security discussion, but also on action. So from that perspective, you wouldn't say that I would think that we were an effective member in the context of the Charter of the Council, right? But from the broader context, I think it was a difficult time. We adopted resolutions that were not enforced. We adopted resolutions that were difficult, and as much as we explained our position, we are given room for the instrumentalization of the council. And the hope is that as much as we are principled and consistent, we were in a relay, and we hope that will be taken on by others and continue in ensuring that the Security Council is not instrumentalized. There were a lot of actions that were taken outside of the council, and the council was seen as a space where they just bless those validating whatever that was agreed outside, and that was quite difficult. I think also the council was not able to look at how to address middle powers and how they now interact in conflict context. Some have been really positive influence in mediation, but I think some are following the same path of great powers, of minerals exploitation, of promoting national interest over the collective global peace and security scheme. And I believe that that is not the fault of one member, but it's the overall state of affairs, and we need a greater level of discussion, and that's why the seminar work which you referred to, led by Namibia and Amani, are important. So those overall framing and guidance and framework are provided, and then it becomes an effective relay. So irrespective of the member state that is in the council, for A3 and A3 plus, that conversation will continue, just as it did with, for example, 2719. But I thought that for our delegation in a difficult time, and to sometimes great strain and pressure, and perhaps even adverse actions, we were able to maintain our consistency, sticking to international law, and being a principal member state.
So you mentioned things that were brought from outside and with the only expectation of the Security Council basically rubber stamping. It's brought to mind the Board of Peace.
I think I walked myself into that, right?
I mean, because it also seems to now actually acquire a life of its own, beyond and above the resolution that blessed it, that is the UN Security Council resolution. And I wonder what that means for Africa, because if conflicts are going to be dealt with on the basis of that kind of a model, I think there is a level of nervousness, anxiety, and I think that point that you were making again and again, really running through our conversation, being principled, consistently principled, but also the reference to UN Charter principles and international law. I think that actually makes a distinction between the so-called rules-based order and the UN Charter principles and international law-based order. I think that's a very important one. So just a quick reflection. Indeed, you invited me to that. So.
Well, I think it's a way for me to go back to two important issues. So one principle, good faith, right? A principle of international law, that you apply your commitment in good faith. And I'll come to what I mean by that in relation to the Board of Peace. The second is how do you use Chapter 8 in the UN Charter particularly when solutions are developed outside of the Security Council, but then are connected to this council because of Chapter 8. So we're looking at the same DRC resolution 2773, using the building blocks of the SADC and EAC communique blessed by the AUPAC, and the major component of that taken to the Security Council that form the basis of the resolution. So that is, you see, good faith and using the charter framework at work. So on the Board of Peace, and I think, again, we don't have that sort of institutional framework for the Middle East. Of course, we have the Arab League, but I mean, different from what we have in the African context. And that we knew. And so when the comprehensive peace plan agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh was placed on the table, some of the conversation was that this was really supported by the countries in the region, right? So there was this idea that it may not be perfect, but it has support from the region. In addition to the United States, we have Egypt and Qatar that were mediators. They've presented this. So the first step was to try to get it a way that is acceptable under international law. So including references of application in good faith, international legal principles we're going to apply, of course, getting the blessing of the Security Council for the stabilization force that is needed in terms of use of force. So all of that was done. And the next step would be application of that resolution 2803 in good faith. So whether the parties now will apply the resolution in good faith is a question certainly of compliance of that party to the resolution of the Security Council. And I need not go into whether, in fact, the charter of the Board of Peace is reflective of the resolution. It has gone outside of the Gaza remit, and that is why we see the non-application of the good faith principle to where the council may be used to endorse because of its legitimacy solutions outside of the council. We can use Chapter 8, or even where Chapter 8 is not present, the council can give its blessing, but it's up and incumbent on the parties to apply whatever that is blessed and endorsed in good faith. And that is the challenge we have with the Board of Peace.
Ambassador Michael, thank you very much for honoring our invitation and joining us to share your rich, very edifying experience leading the permanent mission of Sierra Leone to the United Nations in the UN Security Council for the past 2 years, achieving a lot of remarkable milestones in the course of that period, including most, not least of all, for Africa, showing how consistently being principled can be advanced irrespective of the size of a country in the way that we imagine size to matter. One of the things that people often talk about is which of the big countries will take the 2 permanent seats of Africa. And one of the things that I have always been saying is that why do you think that it's only those countries that would have interest and that would be able to advance it, to advance Africa's interests? I think there is a possibility of that being actually beyond and above what people may consider to be candidates. So it has been really wonderful to watch from a distance and also to accompany you from time to time through the work that we do at Amani Africa, and to learn from your really inside vantage point after having been under the pressure cooker, as you described it. Thank you so much, really. Extremely grateful for all your collaboration, the support that you provided us for Amani Africa as well, and of course the lessons from your experience being taken over by the succeeding, as you said, it's a relay, so the succeeding membership. And personally, and at Amani Africa, we wish you all the best for all the great things to come.
Thank you so much. Thank you indeed, dear brother Solomon Dr. Dresu. Yes, I hope the pressure cooker, the pressure pot has really produced a delicious meal. To the point on the reform, Sierra Leone's responsibility is to coordinate the C10 in advancing the common African position. We have no interest in the seat, so we'll get to that once we'll cross the bridge once we get there, once we have the 2 seats, permanent seat. But allow me, if I may, in thanking you for your cooperation personally, but also Amani Africa, and indeed using the work that you do to really learn a bit more of what's happening in the African peace and security context, including the work of the AUPSC. It's quite a valuable work, and I commend you and Amani Africa for that. You also briefed in one of our meetings and provided a framework for South Sudan. I hope members of the Security Council will continue to look at this. South Sudan was really dear to my heart. I chaired the 2206 Sanctions Committee. I wanted to visit, but again, geopolitics, for some reasonable amount of resources, we couldn't proceed with the visit when it was needed the most. But lastly, yes, I usually say I was the face of the team in New York, but there was a whole machinery above me that my principals, His Excellency President Bio, Foreign Minister Timothy Kaba, the whole of government that supported me, the Vice President and Chief Minister, but also the team that served in New York, political coordinators and experts. They were wonderful. It's a small country, limited resources, but it took all of us to continue to be principled and consistent. And I'm grateful for the support and work which they did. And wishing you the very best, and continue to follow your space, and we look forward to a successful summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much again.